Good evening, everybody. Thank you for coming in today. Sorry for the delay. My name is Summer, and on behalf of Harvard Bookstore, I'm so excited to welcome you to our virtual event tonight with Phil Tinline presenting his new book, Ghosts of Iron Mountain: The Hoax of the Century, Its Enduring Impact, and What It Reveals About America Today, in conversation with John Summers. Tonight's event will conclude with some time for your questions. If you have a question, pop it in the Q&A box, and our authors will answer them at the end of the talk. And if you don't already own a copy of Ghosts of Iron Mountain, I'll be putting links to order through our website in the chat if you'd like one. As always, thank you for buying books from Harvard Bookstore. Your purchases support events like this and help to ensure the future of our local independent bookstore. And now I'm pleased to introduce tonight's speakers. Phil Tinline is a British freelance writer and documentarian. He is the author of The Death of Consensus: 100 Years of British Political Nightmares, which was chosen as the Times London's Politics Book of the Year. Over the course of 20 years working for the BBC, he has made and presented many acclaimed documentaries about how political history shapes our lives. He's also written for The Times London, The Guardian, The Daily Telegraph London, The New Statesman, BBC History Magazine, and Prospect. John Summers, a historian in Cambridge, is writing a biography currently of the sociologist C. Wright Mills for Simon & Schuster, and he is also the editor of Atrocities of the Mind, Dwight MacDonald on Art, Violence, and Politics in the American Century, to be published by the University of Chicago Press this fall. Tonight, Phil is presenting his new book, Ghosts of Iron Mountain, which best-selling author Nathan Hill reviewed, saying, "We must all give thanks to Phil Tinline for exposing this conspiracy of conspiracies, the scheme of schemes. A story so good that once you see it everywhere." So we're so pleased to host this event tonight. Please join me in welcoming Phil and John. All right. Go ahead and...
I didn't hear the drum roll. Are we ready?
Oh, yes, you're good. You're good.
Okay. Okay. Thank you, Summer, very much. Welcome, Phil, virtually to Cambridge.
Thank you.
And congratulations on the book.
Thank you very much. That's great to hear. Thank you.
It was a very startling read in many respects, and I had to take a lot of notes. So let me just see if I can get this straight. A book called Report from Iron Mountain was published in 1968. The book was purported to be leaked from a special study group commissioned by Bob McNamara, the U.S. Defense Secretary at the time, in cahoots with NSC advisor McGeorge Bundy and Dean Rusk, Secretary of State, right?
Mm-hmm.
It supposedly revealed the way that a certain group of social scientists in the Johnson administration talked among themselves about war and peace, specifically about the impossibility of ever having peace in the United States. The US economy needed war to function, according to this report. But as you say, the special study group never actually existed. The book, in fact, was entirely concocted by a small group of liberal satirists who did so to draw attention to the crackpot thinking in the Johnson administration that was currently destroying Vietnam and seemingly planning for World War III. So far, so good?
Yes, published in November 67, but yes, absolutely.
Well, I get that wrong, sorry. So, but you say the twist here is that the satire made the point so effectively that it wound up spreading the very quality of mindlessness that it sought to puncture. And it did so to some very dangerous people on the extreme right, who either didn't know or didn't care that the whole thing had been made up. So you trace a kind of daisy chain of political irony, and we wind up in some pretty dark places. So the story of the satire and the hoax raises a lot of very interesting questions that are quite relevant to contemporary conspiracy thinking. It asks us, as I read it, to think critically about how we imagine power and how power imagines us. Maybe it suggests that it's not what you think, but how you think. that matters the most. So maybe before we get into some of those questions, you can talk us through the kind of symbolic heart of the story of um, this Iron Mountain. It was a real place, right? You say it's a literal deep state.
Yes, it's a real place. It's about 100 miles or so north of Manhattan. And I'm not sure it's all that much of a mountain, but it is an extraordinary place as it's described. And I should say two things before we go any further. Firstly, that I requested access to the site and was not allowed. It is a very secure site, and so that's understandable. And Iron Mountain is now the name of a corporation that still runs that site, but that corporation has nothing to do with this story. The name happens to come from the same site, but there is otherwise no substantive connection. So this place began in the 19th century as an iron mine. It then becomes a mushroom farm. And then after the Second World War, when there's a sort of fad for nuclear bunkers amid much fear that a Third World War is imminent, the owner of the mushroom farm has a bright idea. Why don't I turn this over to a sort of document store and, in certain cases, bunker for executives to flee to when the worst happens and the bombs start hitting New York? They can, the theory went, get in helicopters and zip up to Iron Mountain, and they would have their documents stored. They would have facilities. They would have extraordinary things, a kind of chandelier room and executive suite, a great world map on the wall of a huge room. It's almost sort of James Bond stuff. But this is all described in the Wall Street Journal in early 1966 when the proud owner lets journalists in. So that's the real place. The reason I call it a literal deep state, I mean, obviously with my tongue in my cheek, is that there are a whole bunch of places like this that were ready, as I think people now know quite well, but at the time not so much, which were prepared and ready for different bits of the American government to the federal government and associated agencies to flee to. There was obviously Strategic Air Command in Omaha, Nebraska. There was a place in, I think, Virginia where a kind of secret door from a hotel where Congress would hide. That was actually kept secret for quite a long time. You see reports in the press at the time of mysterious goings on and hints that there might be some other bunker developing. So they're a perfect image, and this is why the satirists alighted on it, I think. They're a perfect image of this sense of secrecy and exclusivity and planning for war that the public aren't allowed in on, even though they're paying for it, that is just so redolent to that idea of not only the Cold War, but that of kind of, you know, secret groups of men at the heart of power.
Yes, and there was Raven Rock as well in southern Pennsylvania, which I discovered existed long after I moved away from southern Pennsylvania and discovered that I had had a target on my back growing up the entire time because I grew up about 2 miles from where the site was, which I thought,
Right.
well, thanks a lot. All right. So supposedly, according to the book, the hoaxers said that this report came out of Iron Mountain was concocted there by a group of social scientists. So what did the report, which I feel like I have to keep saying wasn't real, and we'll get into that a little bit. What did they say was discussed there? What were some of the kind of leading concepts? And who were these guys? Who were these liberal satirists who did this?
Okay, so the liberal satirists are a guy called Victor Navaski and his two henchmen, as it were, Richard Lingerman and Marvin Kipman, who have been running a very sort of high-end quarterly satire magazine called Monocle from the end of the 1950s, initially as students at Yale Law School, and then they make a go of it in the sort of satire boom, which they're pioneers of in Manhattan in the sort of first half of the 60s. By this point, they'd moved more into the sort of publishing books, which is one reason we head in this direction. But what happens is that in early 1966, the Vietnam War obviously is hotting up, but there is this brief moment where it looks like there might be an outbreak of peace. And on Wall Street, shares dip. It's what's called a peace scare. As you will know, C. Wright Mills had written about this in the courses of World War III. They didn't really see this coming and were rather shocked that the stock market would be down on the idea of peace breaking out. But they spot a satirical premise, which is what if we concoct the story of a top secret, as you said, government commissioned committee whose job it is to scope out what would happen to America if permanent global peace broke out. The joke being that it would wreck the economy, destroy society, that terrible things would have to be done to replace the great social benefits of war, and that this is so incendiary when they report back to the Johnson administration that it has to be suppressed. And so that's the premise of it. They then bring in a writer called Leonard Lewin, who's not the same generation. He's born about 15 years earlier, around 1916, and has had a pretty tough time through the 30s and 40s. And he brings to it a certain kind of sternness. They're quite kind of youthful and larky. And what he says is, if we're going to make up the story of the suppression of this report, I've got to write the report. So he spends 18 months doing just that, calling on advice from all sorts of people, not least J.K. Galbraith. The other players in the story are the publishers, of course, because you can't do this unless you have publishers on side. And this is, again, to me, just pure mid 1960s kind of confident larkiness. They go to this publisher, the Dial Press on Third Avenue, very reputable publisher, publishes Norman Mailer, publishes James Baldwin, and say, outline their scheme. And before Lewin has put fingers to typewriter keys, they say, yep, great, we'll commission that. They've worked with them before. And not only that, we will accidentally forget to tell our sales staff that it's not real and that it's actually entirely concocted and fictional. And so it's published, and we'll get onto this in a second, I guess, but it's published in November 67 after Lewin has very sort of effortfully written the whole thing. But what he also does, apart from writing the report, is concoct a whole, as you would need to, of course, a whole sort of shaggy dog story, a whole sort of ruse at the beginning of the book in the so-called introductory material, which sets up how he, of all people, ended up with this incendiary document in his possession. So he tells this whole story about how he was phoned up by this very tense Midwestern professor who he'd spoken to before, he was kind of friends with, who says, I'm in Manhattan, we need to talk. And he's summoned to a restaurant and told this whole story about how the professor was supposedly called up by a mysterious man in Washington who said, I know secrets about you. You've got to join this committee with, as you said, social scientists and war planners and so on, and how they supposedly met. And then the story, the setup that Lewin outlines supposedly for real is that the professor says, well, I stand by the report, but I'm against its suppression. It's got to be made public. You must help me publish it. And so this whole kind of story is what sort of begins the report, and that seemed to work. I mean, Lewin had a record as a satirist. His previous book was a kind of an anthology of American political humor, but somehow nobody spotted that. So the whole bunch of people, as I say, very much in the sort of mid 60s spirit, are the people who come together to do it. But it has sitting underneath it, of course, very serious ideas. The idea that you're writing about the C. Wright Mills coins in the mid 1950s of the power elite, this kind of nexus of politicians, the military, and business working in a kind of concentration of power, not the kind of nice balance of of interests that a sort of slightly more naive liberal perspective might suggest, and that feeds through obviously into the idea of the military-industrial complex. It's informed by the idea of the permanent war economy. So they're playing with really sort of serious and thoughtful concepts here, but they are doing it in a very twinkly way.
The amazing thing about the book, I mean, satire typically has a short shelf life,
Mhm.
but this is high concept satire, and this one doesn't have a short shelf life. When you were reading it, were you convinced? Were you sympathetic? Were the ideas hard to follow? Did it sound like, something that could have come out of the government to you?
I mean, it did. I should show you. I have the first edition here. I mean, you can see it's not presented as anything other than, quite a sort of dry document. And the experience of reading it is kind of weirdly compelling for a sort of perverse reason, which is that, as you said, it does have the quality quite often. I have a very boring life. I read a lot of think tank reports, and it felt often like I was, my eyes were slightly beginning to glaze over because it has that very sort of dry pointedly objective quality to the prose. There's no sort of, ironically, there's no larkiness to it. It's very sort of dry and think tanky, and that is absolutely deliberate. Lewin wanted to lampoon and sort of exaggerate the tenor of these reports that would come out of the Rand Corporation or the Hudson Institute or whatever at the time. That was part of what he was trying to mock. But of course, it's also a satire, and it has these extraordinary, horrific alternative things that you would have to do to replace the effects of war. So you're reading this kind of quite dry report going through these kind of conceptual ideas, and then suddenly it says that it wants to that you would have to introduce a sophisticated form of slavery, or you would have to get young men to play blood games. It's a very weird, jarring experience, but no, it has. It has, I think, about 100 footnotes. Lewin built into fake ones to show that it was made up. But it was hard work to do. He was off down to Washington consulting people in institutes there. Consulting, as I say, J.K. Galbraith, a guy called Ping Ferry, who at one point McNamara had talked about bringing in as his press secretary. It was a very high-end operation in terms of the level of research, and that does give it, as you said, a very sort of eerily genuine quality, which is what the satire needs to have its punch.
So I was wondering if you could talk just a little bit about, I think, two of the concepts that are pretty important, and others that you think are everyone needs to understand. But one is the concept of the power elite, which C. Wright Mills published a book by that name in 1956. So it had been around for a while. It was a hugely successful book all over the world. And the other is this less well-known concept that had been around, I think, since the early 40s, maybe, yeah, the early 40s, called the permanent war economy. For those who may not know, especially the second, I wonder, could you talk a little bit about how the report from Iron Mountain presented these concepts?
Sure, and I'll just sort of set out a brief sort of version of them. I mean, the permanent war economy, sometimes the permanent arms economy, as you say, comes partly out of Trotskyism, I think, actually, in the 1940s. There's a guy called Ed Sard, which I think is a pseudonym, who is one of the people concerned. But I mean, you can see a version of it really in 1984. The idea that the only way that you would be able to sustain the economy, obviously, this is a generation haunted deeply by the Depression in the 1930s. The only way you would be able to reconstruct and sustain a kind of sort of capitalist economy would be through the production and consumption or usage of weaponry on an industrial scale. There is an argument, as you will know, that was what rescued America from the Depression rather than the New Deal. That's debated, but that was certainly a concept that was around at the time. So that's the permanent arms economy, and Mills obviously was thinking about that. But also the power elite, as I say, is this idea of a sort of nexus of politicians and business people and the military operating not in cahoots, not in a conspiracy, but in a similar mode of thinking based on the idea that now that we are post the Second World War, now we're in the Cold War, the only sensible way to do things is on the basis that we have to put sort of militarization absolutely front and center, and that has all sorts of implications for, the not quite the freedom of the media, but the way that the media is conducted, the kind of concepts that are acceptable, and so on. So there's a sort of sense that there is, as I say, power concentrating in quite a stern and militarily focused fashion in America, and that this is something that is jarring and new. That this is taking us into the world of the entangling alliances against which the founders had warned. This is not the world of the 19th century where America successfully stayed free of conflict on the European continent and so on. And so this is a sort of whole set of angst and traumas, I think, that are around in America after 1945, because America has now become the most powerful nation the world had ever seen. It's founded as a plucky republic of small farmers rebelling against the great evil British Leviathan. It's now become something of a Leviathan itself, and that's kind of a jarring and strange thing. And we'll get onto the thinking of some of the conspiracy theorists who embraced the report, but one of the reasons they embraced it is precisely because it speaks to that. So that's what it is at a sort of serious level, partly playing on the idea that, or deliberately satirically exaggerating to the point of outrageous absurdity, the idea that the American economy depends on the horrors of war to sustain itself. And that is an idea that, obviously has, as often in this territory, some basis in truth. It's just that, as I say, they extend it to a kind of absurd satirical extreme.
right. And the power elite as an idea, um, part of the traction was that um, the model was attempting to catch up with reality, with innovations that you're talking about. So I think there were maybe other two models at the time, and maybe still only two other models. The liberal theory of power, which answers the question of who rules America by saying no one rules America because we have a balance of powers and everything balances in checks, and Mills is pretty withering about that. The other is the Marxist theory of power, which says, well, whoever controls the point of production and private capital rules, the businessman rules. And neither of those models quite captured the growth of the Pentagon, the growth of the national security state. And this is the thing that Mills introduces. He introduces some other things too, but this is the core contribution: is that we need a different way of thinking about power, a new way of thinking about power, and which feeds into and is really the predicate for Dwight Eisenhower's military-industrial complex speech, right? So these satirists, they're not. I said that they were liberal satirists. I suppose they were, but they're not. They're responding to something new, right? And so there's a kind of novelty about it and a kind of urgency about it. And so the political atmosphere in 1967 and then in 1968 is fairly riled up. Can you speak a little bit about then the reception that the book got when it was published, and why it did as well as it did?
Well, it's so the stage that America and the Vietnam War have reached by November 1967 is markedly sort of darker and more severe than it had been when they conceived the report 18 months earlier. Just before it's published, you have, I think on the 21st of October, 1967, you have the March on the Pentagon. You've also had huge protests in New York. You have increasingly in the press a sense that we're not going to go along with, government euphemisms and government obfuscation. There's this phrase, the credibility gap, which is so prevalent that the National Review is advertising a board game called Credibility Gap. There's, Ladies' Home Journal publishing the horrors of what napalm does to children's skin when it sticks to it. There's a real sense that the government is not to be trusted on this subject, and that Vietnam is going terribly wrong and they won't admit it and can't see a way out. So it's a very vexed and tense and febrile moment. I mean, it's perfect timing for when it lands. And so this is an administration that is becoming paranoid. Johnson in particular is becoming quite paranoid and is on edge about how it is perceived. You can see in the paper, I've read Rostow's papers for the week that this is all kind of really hitting, and you can see this constant attempt to sort of reassure Johnson about how his actions are being interpreted. And so what happens is that journalists get wind of this report, and so they phone the White House and say, "Is this real?" And the White House said, well, the guy on the phone or whatever says, well, we'll have to check, and that's what they wanted. They just wanted that opening of uncertainty. I mean, Lewin says this when he finally fesses up in 1972. That was the only way to get people to think like this. Could it possibly be real? So there's an investigation in the White House to find out whether it is indeed real or not. I mean, I think they suspect pretty strongly that it's a hoax, but they need to be sure. And you can see the memos going all the way up to President Johnson. There's a scribble in what looks like his handwriting saying, "Call me Walt." And he contacts Walt Rostow, his linchpin national security advisor, who has an investigation launched. There are also investigations in the Pentagon, which you referred to, and in the Arms Control and Disarmament Agency, which takes a little longer. And all the time this is happening, journalists are talking to officials and talking about this. You can see it sort of buzzing around Washington, and some of them are saying, well, this is kind of how people think in power. Now, that's an easy thing to say as a sort of, dry remark in a bar to a journalist. Whether you could actually stand it up is another question, but it's very much the sense that this is speaking to something, that is actually, something of an issue. And Walter Cronkite, the legendary CBS news anchor, talks about it on his radio show, CBS radio show, and says the problem with this is that it reads as though it is real. And there's this extraordinary moment in Lewin's diaries where they're talking about how to publicize it, and they're having most of the report run in Esquire magazine, which is, the embodiment of this sort of playful, satirical, irreverent kind of mid-60s spirit. And Harold Hayes, the great editor who had sort of steered Esquire into this brilliant sort of mode and has agreed to publish the report without telling his readers it's not real, says, well, they're asked would they send someone to talk about it on Johnny Carson? And Hayes apparently says, well, why do we send a man in a mask who is supposedly, presumably going to be the professor? Thankfully, they don't do that. It could have been extreme. But this ends up on the New York Times bestsellers list. It's translated into 15 languages. Later, it's on university reading lists. I talked to somebody who studied it at university and so on. Lewin does a publicity tour, having to, he sets himself the principle of not lying, because of course he's attacking the government for lying, but also not fessing up that it's a hoax because that would ruin the satirical impact. So he goes through all sorts of, he's very pleased, his son told me, he came back from this very pleased that he'd managed to keep the balance. He would say things like, it is what it is, or I'm not sure we really are going to benefit very much from discussing that, all these sort of actually quite politician-like obfuscations. But it worked well enough for it to just stir that uncertainty, which is what they wanted.
I was sort of surprised. I don't know why. Was that John Kenneth Galbraith played a role in perpetuating the hoax?
Yeah, well, yes, having also been involved in it. I mean, he, I think, was a contact of Nowaski's and provided some, advice on the economics. Lewin obviously wasn't an economist. He just written a book called The New Industrial State, arguing that the military and the government were, too closely, cozily in cahoots, very much in a non-conspiracist vein. But he's also written a pamphlet called How to Get Out of Vietnam. He was pretty, disaffected with how it was going. So clearly happy to help out, but also again had that really playful sort of sense to him. I mean, he wrote satires for Esquire, and so he writes a review of it in Washington, in, I think it's a book trust, the Washington Post book review supplement, basically, it was also published in the Chicago Tribune. Under a pseudonym, which those in the know knew was him, Herschel McClandress, and there's a photo of him sort of all broken up. You can tell it's him, where he basically says, "Well, I was asked to take part in this committee, but unfortunately, I was too busy. But I think what they found is perfectly reasonable. They should have psychologically conditioned the public before they published it." So it's very kind of playful. But a few months later, he and Lewin are separately both over here in the UK, and Galbraith is asked about this at the University of Cambridge and says he's basically got cold feet and wants to kind of back out of the play acting and says, I was a member of the conspiracy, meaning the conspiracy to concoct the satire. But of course, that phrase, a member of the conspiracy, then becomes evidence that he was really involved in something very dark and sinister for decades afterwards.
That's so they both fess up. Leonard Lewin, who is the author of Report, all of it, he wrote under his own name the introduction, and claimed that he had gotten this report from this mysterious, professor who came in. But in fact, he wrote the whole thing. But Lewin fesses up that and Galbraith fesses up eventually that it was fake. It was a hoax. So, what effect does their confessions did their confessions have on, the public perception of the authenticity? The government has denied it and said it never happened. They've said it never happened. This is when things get kind of strange.
Yeah, right. So I mean, Lewin doesn't do that until 1972, after the Pentagon Papers have been published, on the principle that satire has been trumped by reality, to coin a phrase. But Galbraith kind of hints at it earlier, but people have begun to work out that it might well be him, not that long afterwards. But then you get this great debate about who wrote it, and so Henry Kissinger is coming to the fore at this point and takes time out of trying to bring peace to Vietnam by saying this report is nutty. Herman Kahn, one of the bases of Dr. Strangelove, who Lewin was satirizing, there's muttering that maybe it was him, and he goes on TV to talk about it. Was it Noam Chomsky, again, coming to prominence after the March on the Pentagon, and so on? There's all these people, and that, again, is quite telling that all these people who could have been Richard Godwin, Richard Revere, Kenneth Boulding, and so on. And so that's the kind of the second wind of it at the time. But then it basically fades because it is, as I say, of that confident late 60s moment, which once you hit the Tet Offensive and the assassinations of Martin Luther King and Robert Kennedy and all the police violence and the protests and so on in Chicago, then Nixon, then My Lai, then Kent State, then Fred Hampton, America is in a very different place very quickly after this. It's also got inflation, it's obviously got stagflation in the 70s. By the time you get into the 70s, the idea that the government's got too much money to spend and needs to blow it all on war is kind of a nice problem to have. So by the time you get to the 80s, it just looks like a relic from another time. Lewin tries to get it republished to no avail, even though Galbraith is ready to help him. But then he discovers in 1990 that it has been republished. It's been republished by fascists who think it's a genuine government document and that they can publish it because as a product of the government, it's not in copyright. So he's suddenly faced horrifically as a left-wing Jewish writer with basically people who are pioneers of Holocaust denial in America publishing his work as though it's real and has to take legal action to tackle it, which drags on for 4 years. So it suddenly sort of turns into this kind of lurching, slightly sickening place, having been at the beginning, a lark.
So, right, this is the transformation, and this is the very strange part. So you say, it was a satire. It was sort of it was technically a conspiracy of a small number of liberal satirists to write satire, but the content of the work itself was not a conspiracy theory.
No, no. It becomes a conspiracy theory once it's put in the context of other people's preordained suspicions about power. Because
It sort of changes its nature from a satire to a conspiracy when it gets over to the right wing. That's very interesting.
Precisely. And if you think about it, satire and conspiracy theory are in one sense extremely similar. They both say this is reality as it appears, but actually, what if there's something else behind it? And they also take, something real and extend it to the point of absurdity. It's just one is doing it for one effect and one is doing it for another effect. But it also speaks to this idea, which particularly in the early 1990s was very live on the right, had been before, had been in the 50s and 60s, in the 30s, that there is this kind of malignant presence in the heart of power. Now, the reason the report is so fertile for this is because of those alternatives for what you would have to do if war disappeared. So if you're talking about sophisticated forms of slavery and blood games and eugenics and poisoning the atmosphere and possibly UFO scares, that is such a rich range of associative ideas that if you want to suggest that, as people do, that there is this evil force inside the government, all you have to do is find mentions of things of that kind and sort of associate them with this document, and then you can say, well, it's documented that they wanted to do this. Now, actually, they're saying that they wouldn't want to do it. They'd rather have war continue. So the idea that, for example, the end of the Cold War, which really kind of kicks up renewed interest in this, is something that they were somehow plotting in the late 60s when they were saying that the end of war would be bad. There's no real logic to it except the underlying idea that there is this committee of evil men at the heart of government, and that once you've got that fixed in your head, all you really need is documents that suggest it's the case and associate it with things you don't like, and you can kind of construct whatever narrative you want. So, yes, it's not a conspiracy theory at all in itself, really. It's just very fertile material for people who want to build on.
And the alternatives are pretty scary.
Right.
I wonder if you could just explicate that just a little bit.
Sure.
So, for example, U.S. government needs to keep war going. If somehow peace broke out,
Hmm.
society would become unstable,
Yeah.
and they would have to do what to the environment?
So the idea is that war is the basic social system, and that war is the only reason you can have a nation state, and war is the only basis on which you can assert authority over the people by kind of frightening them, and so that authority is dependent on war. So the reason you would have to poison the environment in the report's absurd set of examples is that if war ends, you need some sort of unifying enemy. So the unifying enemy would have to be environmental destruction, gross pollution of the environment is the phrase. They talk about the idea of inventing fake alien scares, and they actually say that would be very difficult, but even so, UFO people later on can make use of that. The sophisticated form of slavery thing is about keeping young men under discipline and control. And it's striking that when it's published in the first place, the kind of people who seem to me to be, as best I can tell, to be most susceptible to believing it's real are not unreasonably young men who are worried about being kind of pulled into the Vietnam meat grinder for, as it seems, the power of the state and the profit of the corporations. So that again is where the blood games idea comes in, that you would have to kind of get all the sort of potentially fascistic or anarchic or violent fury out of young men. You'd have to kind of pit them against each other. what this is actually doing is saying this is one of the reasons why, war seems so useful, but it becomes, for instance, an explanation of why the Waco siege happens. Maybe this is, the evil elite forcing, the ordinary real Americans to fight in blood games. So that those are the kind of they're all satirical, absurd satirical exaggerations of perfectly sensible critiques of, the the reasons why war might be useful to the state. But the crucial thing is the exaggeration to the point of absurdity.
So these critical concepts, power elite, permanent arms economy, they sort of get hollowed out, and what you end up with is this idea that an elite that's bent on making war on the domestic population. And suddenly, when the report is in the hands of gets in the custody of the extreme right, suddenly all these people become Jewish, right? Um,
Yeah. Yes. Yes. I mean, I mean, it's. I would not want for 1 second to temper the perfectly sensible and uh, heavily evidenced accusation of anti-Semitism against um, the organs concerned. They don't push that to the fore that much, but they sort of don't need to. I think the fact that you've got names like Lewin and Davaski in the picture, people are very adept, as you will know, at just enough of a hint. So yes, I think that is certainly part of it. They also call it, new secret protocols, suggest that these are new secret protocols, which is another dog whistle of that kind. I mean, the huge irony being that the protocols they'll design is also a satire that's been repurposed, although obviously the story is slightly different. But I mean, the other thing that happens as a result of this, and we have to be careful about, not splashing blame around inaccurately, but the person who is the great proselytizer of this, who is absolutely talking to these very far right groups, but is not necessarily that far right himself. There's this extraordinary character called Colonel Leroy Fletcher Prouty, who had been in the Pentagon, had been in the Air Force, had been involved in helping the CIA set up their special operations, and is one of these people who doesn't seem to be able to make sense of what America had become since 1945. He talks about this repeatedly. And he really is the great proselytizer of the report on the basis it's real, partly arguing that it sounds like people he used to work with in the Pentagon. So the accuracy of Lewin's parody becomes evidence of its authenticity. But he is the person who provides the copy to far right publisher, which they literally tear the cover off, photocopy, and put a new cover on. I can show you it actually.
and this
Like,
is, can you just remind us can you remind us about what year this is that this happened?
sorry. This is he discovers this in the mid 80s, I think. He's certainly writing about it in the mid 80s, in this long series of articles to do with the JFK assassination.
Yeah.
And then it's republished by, as I say, this is the far right edition, in the late 80s, and Lewin discovers that that's happened in 1990. But then what happens is that Fletcher Prouty is also talking to, it gets tangled up with the JFK thing. He's talking to Jim Garrison, who is the New Orleans district attorney who launched this quixotic attempt to, discover what had happened with the JFK assassination in exactly the same time Report from Iron Mountain was coming out, in literally the same couple of months. Has sort of been writing books about it ever since. Prouty and Garrison start talking, and it's as a result of that the idea that the military-industrial complex killed Kennedy, and here's the evidence for it, finds its way to Oliver Stone.
Yes, that was my wow moment when I was reading his.
Right.
And he becomes a character, right? He becomes the character X in Oliver Stone's movie JFK.
Exactly. So the crucial scene, for those who have seen it, where we don't think about how the assassination happened or who did the assassination in terms of the shooting, but why it happened. The great dark reveal, which I remember hitting me for six when I saw it as a teenager, and brilliantly played by Donald Sutherland. There's this character, Mr. X, who Kevin Costner as Garrison meets on the steps of the Lincoln Memorial, I think, and they walk down the mall, and then they sit on a bench with the Washington Monuments and so on in the background, and he reveals the full depth of the military-industrial complex's need for war and the conspiracy and so on. And he says, the organizing, something like the organizing principle in front of me, the organizing principle of any society, Mr. Garrison, is for war. Now, the quote in Pruti's articles about the report from Iron Mountain is war itself is the basic social system. So it's pretty directly based on what Pruti is taking from Report from Iron Mountain. And Pruti was a real former Pentagon employee. That bit of the story is real. It's just that what he is quoting is a hoax. And so, right at the heart, the explanatory heart of JFK is this character who was a conspiracy theorist who believed the hoax was real and quotes it as the reason in the end why JFK supposedly had to be killed at the core of the movie. And so, yeah, once I found that, I thought, oh, okay, I think this is more than a chapter.
Yes, and so and the reason, according to Oliver Stone and Pruti, is that allegedly Kennedy wanted to um, uh, get out of Vietnam. What was it? Put the generals in their place. In other words, he wanted peace, right?
That's the argument, and it comes down to two national security advisory memos and so on. And the argument is that one says, is Kennedy saying let's have peace, and the other is Johnson saying no, let's have war. And you sort of see him being pushed to sign it in a sort of imagined black and white cabal, smoky back room in the movie. I mean, actually, the historical evidence doesn't. I'm simply drawing here on historians who have made this their life's work. The evidence just doesn't seem to be there. I mean, the speech that Kennedy was on his way to make at the Dallas Trade Mart, he was going to say, we must not weary of the task about Vietnam. Robert Kennedy said we never had serious plans to pull out. There is a group in the government who seem to be discussing the possibility of pulling out. In the CIA, who supposedly wanted to keep the war going so badly they killed the president. It doesn't really make a lot. Another really interesting argument is the historian Frederick Loggeval argues, who is at Harvard, not very far from where you are, argues that actually had Kennedy wanted to pull out in that period, there's this rebellion, Buddhist rebellion against the regime in Saigon, which is put down with great violence to the disgust and horror of the American public, and that would have been a perfect opportunity. So the evidence, to my mind at all, and certainly to the much more eminent historians than me that I've read, simply isn't there. But as you say, that is the theory. And that's where that idea from Mills is completely transfigured. I would argue that when Eisenhower talks about the military-industrial complex, drawing his speechwriter Malcolm Moose, political scientist, drawing on Mills, drawing on the power elite, that idea is pretty close in a way to Mills's argument, but the transfiguration of it happens in the course of the 60s when it sort of totalized into this kind of numinous force somewhere in the heart of the state, as against a perfectly reasonable critique of cozy relations between the Pentagon and corporations, to become this kind of, omnipotent, omniscient presence, in corridors, which can do, which can kill a president in middle of a public square in daylight and never get caught. So that transition is one of the things that ends up sort of transfiguring Report from Iron Mountain too.
So Kennedy goes from someone that Mills really loathes and a kind of figure of the power elite
Hmm.
uh, uh, to a victim of um, the power elite, killed because he wanted peace somehow.
Yeah,
Uh,
yeah, yeah. And it's very retrospective. I mean, Vietnam is not Laos is more important than Vietnam at the time. But once you get to the latter end of the 60s, and perfectly reasonably, people want an explanation about how do we get ourselves into this horrific mess. Now, there are explanations which are, more useful, I think, which do pertain to, conspiracy thinking, like the idea that Johnson felt that there was a sort of, or at least he felt he had to kowtow to the idea that there was a sort of global communist conspiracy, and on the domino theory, you have to fight it in Vietnam because if you don't fight in Vietnam, it'll capture Southeast Asia and from there the world, sort of thing. So the sort of thinking that the conspiracy theories are trying to skewer is kind of there. It's just not where they think it is.
we're not going to have enough time for me to tell you all the things I liked about your book and why I think it's so important people should read it. But let me just compliment you on one thing. I think in the hands of a less scrupulous journalist, this story about left and right, would wind up as a kind of tale of equivalencies. well, they're both kind of nuts. And you make a point several times, a caution against that. Can you say a little bit more about that? What's the difference? You hinted at a little bit.
Yeah, I mean, I think there is, it is worth thinking about how the idea of a sort of centrist and centralized powerful force, which the Vietnam War, the Johnson administration absolutely embody, does antagonize both people on the left and people on the right. And indeed, as you say, Kennedy is somebody that Mills is no fan of, just as General Edwin Walker on the far right is an enemy of Kennedy. So I do think it's worth looking at the confluences between their views, and Report from Iron Mountain to some extent illustrates that in that it comes from the left but ends up appealing to the right. But there is the great difference. The left created, those left wingers created as a satire, it's embraced as a conspiracy theory. And there are rhymes, but I think it's just as important, if not more important, to attend to the differences. So I mean, one very basic difference is that the far right in America has demonstrably killed far more people, fellow citizens, than the far left. The point that David Newark, the great expert on the militias and so on, has made pretty forcefully. So I think there is a tendency. There's also another thing, curiously, is I think the right look to the left for ideas at certain points in a way the left perhaps don't look to the right in the same way. But I think there is a depth to the fear of the centralized state that is on the right that is not paralleled on the left, because much as the left, in the 60s and 70s, for example, over something like COINTELPRO, for, to some extent, perfectly reasonable justification, is very suspicious of the FBI, very suspicious of the centralized state, suspicious of the state that's fighting in Vietnam. When it comes down to it, one thing that constitutes a sort of left-wing view, generally speaking, is some sort of faith that a kind of FDR-ish central state can do good. Now, that's not something that people on certainly the sort of this part of the right need to support their worldview at all. We're back to the Republic of Small Independent Farmers, protected by their guns and their guard, which is much more deeply open to the idea that government is simply evil, which is what takes you off down this rabbit hole. So I think that's the kind of probably the most substantive difference.
That's great. Um, yeah, that's very useful. The other thing I really appreciated about your book is not just the even-handedness, but also the use of historical analysis. And the reason I think it's important is um, when we talk about conspiracy theories, or when we're told about conspiracy theories and conspiracy thinking, I should say, it's always, the technology is to blame, or some neuroscientist will tell us how our brains are wired. And then we have metaphors of red pills and blue pills and so forth. There's always this kind of explanation, kind of hard explanation into our susceptibility and why this is happening. But you show this process taking place through the pages of history and elective affinities with sort of major events, and showing how people are making these conclusions. And there's something very both old-fashioned and refreshing about the way you tell the story, and how that we don't necessarily need, neuroscientific theories to understand how our brains latch on to certain things. And American political history in this book looks interesting, contemporary American political history, by which I mean since the war. It's not a contest between socialism and capitalism, or between collectivism and freedom. It's sort of between elites and masses, or big men and little men. I wonder if you could speak just a little bit about that. You know, war as an institution it draws this distinction between little and big and hierarchies.
It,
Um,
it
yeah,
It does, but I think there's also a distinction within war between the warfare state, the kind of the gargantuan Death Star, as I call it, the Pentagon, which is actually also quite bureaucratic and quite faceless, and then the warrior. And I mean, it's very striking to me reading Mills saying that he had a certain he had more time, let's say, for the Civil War general who showed his leadership by riding harder and killing more efficiently and so on, and talks about militias as well, and the rifle giving men some agency, as against, the general who shows his mettle by, being particularly efficient with his paperwork, or, being particularly objective from the corridors of the Pentagon. So no, I think war kind of brings that out, within itself. Anyway, but also I do think, as I've said, the expansion of the American state, first in the First World War and then hugely in the Second World War, does jar against a version of America which values smallness, the independent yeoman farmer. And I think that, I mean, this is a very simplistic point in a way, but there is something about the geographical size of America, which I think points to, its immensity is very, very hard, if not impossible, to compute. The distance that many people live from Washington is far greater than the distances they do in smaller countries. The size of corporations that develop once you have the railroads and the robber barons and so on is so immense that that has a kind of, a sort of almost inhuman scale to it. I mean, as you know better than me, this is something that Mills is very alive to. And so I do think that the sense of bigness is something that becomes very, it's almost not visible because it's a sort of basic and amorphous concept, but it is something you can see in the journalism in the 40s and 50s. It is something that people talk about. You have Louis Brandeis talking about, the curse of bigness and so on. You can see it in 1984 again, which is partly Orwell's understanding of how America thinks. He talks about, the American tendency to admire science for its own sake, in an essay on James Burnham, American thinker. And so I do think that it is once you look, it's sort of everywhere. You can see that sense of smallness over dominated by bigness. And then you can see, as you go through the post-war period, rebellions against that. So there's the great advertising man, Bill Bernbach, wrote a memo, I think, in about 1947 called Stay Small. This is the guy who does the Beetle advert. You then have E.F. Schumacher writing Small is Beautiful against Big is Beautiful in the 70s as the environmental movements kicking off. So I think it's actually a really useful and fertile way to understand how you end up with these spheres of power, but also just sort of it's helped me make sense of, as best I can, of how America is different from Britain, for example.
Let me just state that if you have questions, Phil is happy to take them. Sort of looking in the Q&A, we have some time, and sure that he'd be. I don't see any though, so I'll look for those in the last few minutes that we have, and be happy
Sure.
to. Um, I was a little bit disappointed with the, uh, the original group of liberal satirists. I was given how horrible everything went, and you link the book to or the hoax to Timothy McVeigh, and you talk about Roy Vidal and just the corrosive skepticism and in some cases violent actions that it fueled. They reprinted the book, and I thought, hadn't they already mortgaged their credibility? I mean, in some ways, you can read this book as a kind of pretty strong caution against hoaxing.
Right. Yeah, I mean, I think, well, so the reason they republished the book is because it's flying around. Not only is the far right version circulating, but it's flying around on the early internet and in, sort of almost sort of samizdat copies amongst the militia movement that springs up in America in the first half of the 1990s. And then when the Oklahoma City bombing happens on the 19th of April 1995, journalists start to really investigate how these people are thinking, and that's when it comes out that they are so interested in Iron Mountain. And the journalist who discovers this phones up Leonard Lewin, who sounds, does sound pretty sort of deflated and miserable about this. So the reason they republish it is because that brings it back to the fore in 1995, 1996, and the person at the Free Press is interested, and they republish it with some of the early reviews and an introduction by Navasky explaining what happened, and an afterword by Lewin. I mean, I don't know. I'm kind of in two minds about it because I mean, I take your point. I do think there is something specific, as I say, about that moment in the 60s when things like this, it would be very hard to see the consequences of it later. I also should say that I do think it's certainly in the swirl of ideas around McVeigh. I wouldn't want to go as far as to say that it led to the Oklahoma City bombing. I think that would overstate the case. I think the Turner Diaries, for example, is much more important, or a film called Waco: The Big Lie. But it certainly fits into that milieu as they've misinterpreted it. So you can see multiple cases where it's likely that he came across it, which I detail in the book. So yeah, I mean, I think when they hear about it, you can see that they do feel when they meet at the Knickerbocker Bar and Grill, very near the old Monocle office to talk about it, and the New Yorker is there. You can see that there's a certain sort of shadow over the occasion. So I think that they kind of come to a view which is defense of having done it. But I do think there is an emotional kind of ambiguity to how they respond, if that's fair.
So to extend the point of maybe your answer, I have a question, and I'll read it out. It says, referring to the bootleg pirated edition, what uses have right-wingers tried to make of report from Iron Mountain? It seemed to validate their suspicions of big government, but have right-wing thought leaders, and I'm glad this is in quotation marks, scare quotes, tried to use the report for any particular agendas?
Well, one major example is opposing environmental policy. So you can see in the early 90s, you have the Rio Summit, you have the beginnings of a more concerted international attempt to try to take action on the environment. Now, what is outlined in something called Agenda 21 is a set of entirely voluntary things that people could do to address some of this. This is picked up and turned into, and you can see Ted Cruz talking about it, for example, on Glenn Beck's radio show in about 2012 from memory, that this is a sort of a mandate by the tyrannical United Nations to impose all sorts of strictures on the freedom-loving Americans. And one of the ways that it is argued that this is secretly, and this whole agenda, this whole not only literally Agenda 21, but the whole environmentalist agenda is actually a government plot. But one of the ways that this argument is made, not least by a writer for the John Birch Society who went to the Rio Summit, but by other people too, some of them with academic qualifications, is by looking back at Iron Mountain and saying, when they talk about possible alternatives to war, they talk about gross pollution in the environment, but they say, but that's not possible for a generation and a half. And then they do some maths and think, well, if they say a generation and a half in 1967, and here we are in 1992, there we are. They were plotting in 1967 to use fear of environmental pollution to oppress Americans all the way back in the 60s. This is the dastardly plot that lies behind environmentalist policy. So that's one example. And I think you can see it in talk about chemtrails. You can see it in the Oath Keepers actually. It sort of metastasizes and spreads. And there's also a secondary hoax called Silent Weapons for Quiet Wars, which purports to be the operations manual for the elite to manipulate the sheeple, which you can see Alex Jones referring to repeatedly during the pandemic, for example.
So, but the major context is the Cold War is over, right?
Right. Yeah.
Oh,
Yeah.
we can't have peace, right? I mean, this is the whole idea of the book, right? What are
Right.
we going to do now? So
Yeah.
environmentalism becomes a kind of, a false flag refers to an event, right? But a kind of fake, right? It's a kind of fake crisis
Yeah.
that's
Yeah.
used.
Yeah. And
War, war.
one of the curious ambiguities about how people interpret it is you can either say environmental pollution is being massively exaggerated and effectively faked because of what it says in Report from Iron Mountain, the secret plot that reveals, or you can say it's being deliberately contrived. So whether you think it does exist or doesn't exist, you can use the report either way to say that the evil elite is behind it. So it become. I mean, one of the things about conspiracist imagination is it's a very lateral and creative way of thinking, not in an especially helpful way, I would contend, but it is remarkably supple and adaptive. So it can, whatever new facts arrive, it can adapt them. And because the report has this range of alternatives, that makes it a particularly helpful tool in that regard.
I'm told we have one more question that I can ask, and then we're out of time.
Right.
So again, I compliment you on your even-handedness. I didn't find a single overstatement of the entire book. It never
Well,
said that you were getting out ahead of your evidence. You have sort of a lot of footnotes, although report from Iron Mountain also had a lot of footnotes, and some of them were fake, right? I didn't check your
Yep.
footnote. But you end the book by saying that uh, referring to the importance of drawing a line between what is and what feels as if true. What is true versus what feels as if true. And it's a gentle but effective um, stricture, maybe that you close with. What did you mean by that?
Well, I'm taking that idea from a brilliant uh, writer called Ali Russell Hochschild, who is based in Berkeley, and is a liberal or on the left. Took serious risks to fight for civil rights in Mississippi in the 60s and so on. And when the Tea Party happens, excuse me, in around about 2010, she thinks, right, I need to get to know these people. These are my fellow country people. I need to go and meet them and hear their stories and learn how they understand the world. And so she does. She spends 5 years on and off in southern Louisiana, and she condenses what she hears down to a story, which is that they are waiting, they feel, for the American dream in the hot sun on a hill up a slope, and over the hill the queue appears to continue and the queue is not moving, or the line, I should say, the line is not moving, and they're getting more and more frustrated, and then people start cutting in, and when they complain they're blamed for complaining. And so she gives this account back to these people, and they say, yeah, you've got it. And she then fact checks it at the end, and she presents her own liberal alternative to it. So she's not uncritical about it at all, but she says that this is their deep story, and she defines that as a story with fact removed. It's how it's the feels as if story. That's her phrase. And so I'm trying to simultaneously embrace the generosity and sort of, I think, almost moral genius of her book, and the fish called Strangers in Their Own Land, Anger and Mourning on the American Right. The fact that she did that, I think, is wonderful and to be embraced. But there is also that phrase, fact removed. And there comes a point where if you are making political assertions about how power works and you're doing it on the basis that this feels real without bothering about fact, that's where we end up with very serious problems. So, whilst absolutely embracing the importance of story and understanding the narratives through which we all understand the world, me included, obviously, I also think that we have to hang on to the idea that after a certain point, that turns into fantasy. And if you don't attend to when you cross that line, we end up with some of the problems we have today.
And your book illustrates it very well. Um,
Very much.
Phil Tinline, Ghosts of Iron Mountain. Please buy it from Harvard Bookstore. Thank you very much, Phil. It's a pleasure to speak with you.
Thank you so much. Really appreciate it, John. Thank you.
And thank you, you did. Thank you, John, again for coming, and Phil. That was a fantastic event. And thank you to everybody who was able to make it out. Have a good night.
Good night.
Thanks.